I think it's very exciting to be alive at this point where we are moving from one era governed by oil. Yeah, so I was drafted by Nigel Topping, the high-level champion for COP26, onto the extended UNFCCC team, which was known as the Climate Champions. And I was one of the first 5 people on that team. And initially, our goal was just to involve business and civil society in putting pressure on the parties. So the conference of the parties, that's the governments, putting pressure on the governments to get their ambition up in advance of going to make their announcements at COP26 in Glasgow. So that effort started a considerable amount of time before COP26. As it was, COP26 was postponed a year because of the pandemic. So I was on that team for an 18-month contract. And after we launched the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience, which were global campaigns both on mitigation and adaptation, we then split into a sector-by-sector team structure in order to get each sector on board with science-based pathways. And the sector that I was asked to lead was aviation, and aviation was left out of the Paris Agreement along with shipping. As a hard-to-abate sector, it was found too challenging in Paris to know how to bring international emissions from aviation and shipping into the framework of the nationally determined contributions that country by country needs to commit and deliver. So it was left out and left for another day, and that became my challenge. And we succeeded with much consultation across airlines, airports, fuel providers, and international aviation organizations to finally get that sector into the Paris framework, committed to science-based pathway with a long-term goal, and setting breakthrough objectives along that pathway. For example, sustainable aviation fuel uptake to reduce greenhouse gas emissions immediately on dropping in sustainable aviation fuel along with kerosene, and in some cases replacing kerosene entirely. And that's an immediate uplift, which now various airlines are doing. And that's a step in the journey. The ultimate solution is to get to, clean, silent aircraft. And that's really where the hybridization of electric and hydrogen technologies will really come into their full glory, really. A bit like with hybrid cars and the move to electric cars, we'll see a similar thing happening in the aviation world with airplanes, with whole new designs. I mean, for example, Tesla was a sort of new design, and suddenly it was all about the battery with a non-combustion engine. And similarly with aircraft, it'll be all about this combination between, the fuel cell, the hydrogen source, and the battery. And that'll enable long haul as well as short haul aviation to be clean and silent in the future. It's very exciting. A number of companies are actually progressing and delivering this at the moment. Some are in commercial use, like Zero Avia, with commercial cargo run by hydrogen aircraft, lots of electric aircraft companies, and now we're starting to see this hybridization come together. So, lots of excitement around going up the S-curve of technological adoption to move away from kerosene and old-fashioned, noisy, polluting engines to the new world. Definitely not, although there's never a one size fits all in terms of a generalization on, global action on climate change. There are always exemplars and case studies of people both in the private and the public sector and the third sector doing extraordinary things. And I think, in some ways, the UK has really been a bit of a pioneer, which is pleasing to see, because if you think about Great Britain having pioneered the steam engine and the fossil fuel era, now what we're really trying to do is pioneer the post-fossil fuel green economy. And so you really want to, and you kind of are almost obliged to see or to try and find a way that Great Britain leads on that. And I'm pleased to say that our Prime Minister has just been at COP29, increasing the UK's ambition on the reduction of greenhouse gases on 1990 levels by 2035 to 81%. And that's on the back of the UK being the first country in the world to pass the Climate Change Act in 2008, and then the net zero legislation in 2015. And so even though we've had some setbacks, certainly in the last 5 years under the last government, we did have some setbacks moving away from green energy and re-incentivizing more fossil fuels, like drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea, new licenses, 100 new licenses signed off by the Rishi Sunak government, allowing coal mines to go ahead in places like Cumbria when there was a big move prior to that to bring coal to an end. And now we're sort of back on track. We have now stopped coal. That's the last coal-fired power station has now stopped, reached its end of life. And actually coal mines have just been banned this week in the future for the UK. So the UK is stepping up again, and that's just one example. There's many other countries that are doing extraordinary things. And this is not only on the climate mitigation front, but also on the adaptation, sort of biodiversity regeneration front. You take Costa Rica, one of the first countries to set a target of eradicating all fossil fuel use and regenerating its ecosystems. And Costa Rica is now a world leader on that. So there are many examples. It's also nice to see Australia, for example, one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels with a huge carbon footprint, given its hydrocarbon resources, how they've flipped to now really innovating on green energy by a change of government. So it is political. We unfortunately have seen, a new president-elect coming in who is not on that journey in America, who wants to take the US out of the Paris Agreement. He did that in his first term in 2016, and then he wants to do that again now. And, again, go backwards in terms of re-incentivizing fossil fuel drilling and pollution, ironically, when, the rest of the world are right now in Azerbaijan trying to work out how to accelerate the opposite, the transition that was agreed to move away from fossil fuels. There was a lot of debate about the wording in COP28 of transitioning away from fossil fuels. Was it transitioning, completely in a shorter time frame or a longer time frame? A lot of debate about that with loss and damage clauses, etc., because obviously some countries, and mainly the developed ones, have been using fossil fuels for a lot longer than some of the emerging economies. So there's a bit of a balance that needs to be struck in terms of when countries terminate their fossil fuel power stations. So a lot is being done, but it really is frustrating that internationally we can't quite agree on the pace of winding down our fossil fuel dependence. So there's a lot of vested interests in trying to keep fossil fuels alive, whereas the goal is really to bring fossil fuels to an end. Well, I'm hopefully going to be energizing the audience around the opportunities for the green economy. I think it's very exciting to be alive at this point where we are moving from one era governed by oil, really. And let's be honest, all the wars, the conflicts internationally that have been caused by our quest for more oil and our addiction to using so much oil and gas on a daily basis. It's all about the number of barrels of oil and gas, and has been for quite some time, since the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, post the invention of the steam engine. Again, I mentioned earlier, Great Britain pioneered that. And so we have a responsibility now in terms of moving to the post-fossil fuel era. So I'd like to energize people in the audience about opportunities to be involved in that, both in the private sector, in business, but also in the public sector, in the third sector. No matter who you are or where you are, if you're working as a teacher or a nurse, or if you're a business person or a policymaker or a customer, there's so many opportunities to participate in this revolution. That's what it is. If you think back in history, people talk about how there was the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Stone Age. Those ages didn't end because they suddenly ran out of stones or bronze or iron. They moved because humans are very good at adapting. And so we moved to the next era, and we found the next energy source that made sense for that community or that population. And at one point we were using wind because of sailing ships being the best way to drive international trade. And hence, the British East India Company was born on the back of that international trade routes, because we were a great naval nation. Unfortunately, that also brought in the era of human slavery, because then there was the temptation to effectively have cheap slave labor to help with the powering of those ships, but also the trade of slaves themselves. So that became socially totally unacceptable, and we needed to find a way to end or abolish the slave era. Thankfully, we had abolitionists like William Wilberforce and his colleagues John Newton and others who were able to pass in the House of Commons legislation preventing British ships from using slaves at a point in the 1830s where suddenly it became illegal. And then America followed, even though they had a big civil war over the abolition of slavery. It came to an end in America, and then we moved to a new era. The actual new era we moved to was the fossil fuel era. So fossil fuels replaced human slavery. Now what's exciting, and I hope audiences will really grasp this, is the opportunity to move beyond fossil fuels. Because even though fossil fuels did bring a lot of people out of poverty and were hailed as the new gold for many decades, they've now become the problem given the pollution of the combustion by so many people with technological improvements on a daily basis. So we can all find ways to deal with this problem by hastening the new era, the clean, green economy, which will provide opportunities for all with infinite energy and the ability to address inequality in the world, social upliftment, and the eradication of poverty.